Okay, so for the topic of today is going to be maritime choke points and global trade. This is a topic that is related to the previous episode that I did in Spanish, which I will redo in English later. But for the most part, it's going to be something that it's of high relevance, particularly if you follow the news right now. Now, the reason why I want to talk on this topic is because there is not a lot of real consensus information about this. Everything is about the war, but there is no real, hey, what does this mean for me, the average being, so on and so forth. What does this entail, and how is this going to affect my everyday living? In the previous episode, we talked about oil costs, the price of oil and all that kind of stuff. But there's more to it than just that. Which let's go ahead and talk about it. All right. So quickly, we're going to talk about the clear image of the maritime choke points. Particularly, this is going to be a topic we're going to be emphasizing it. Then give real examples about this kind of stuff. And there's a few that we will touch later that y'all know. For a lot of folks, they made memes about it and so on and so forth some time ago. So that's going to be one thing. And then what are governments or what are people doing in order to handle this kind of stuff, because this is important. This map actually shows a really good example of the choke points. It's missing a few of them. For example, it's missing the ones over here in South America, where there is the Strait of Magellan, between basically the Pacific and the Atlantic. There's not major issues there, but it's a strait. There's some political issues with it between Argentina and Chile, but it's not a big deal. But it's definitely something to take into consideration. Also, there is a choke point also where number 19 is, which is basically, a little bit higher, basically where Copenhagen is and all that, because the Russians do like to use basically like St. Petersburg and all that for exports, but because that area is controlled by NATO, that's an issue, but we'll touch a little bit closer on that. But yeah, for the most part, those the map that you see here are basically the areas of focus we're going to touch. And why are these important? So, what is a choke point at the end of the day? A choke point is basically an area where it's surrounded by land or something like that, but it is part of it is navigable, but it's relatively restricted. There's a lot of these, like you saw through the world, that are man-made, and there's others that are natural. Like you're gonna see, like the stretch of Bab el Mandeb. There's also the Strait of Hormuz. Those are natural, but at the same time, you have those that are man-made, like the example of the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal. Those are definitely, things that we need. Now, there's also others that are because of the nature of the waters. For example, Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. That's another great example, where the navigable waters around it are kind of problematic if you're going more south. So basically, even though there's definitely quite a bit of space, they want to stick closer to land than actually, go deeper into the Arctic Ocean. So definitely kind of, Atlantic Ocean in this case. So definitely kind of stuff that we need to touch. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about the importance of choke points. So in the case of the Suez Canal, this accounts about 12% of the total world shipping. That's a lot. We're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars in commerce. And the Panama Canal, with the same token, for example, which is a very important choke point, counts about 4 to 5% of world shipping. It's a little bit less significant, but it's definitely still a subjective, quite objective amount of money. At the same token, Panama Canal, which I will touch later, is imperative to the American naval strategy. So if it's not for Panama, we will see issues where the basically American might be more problematic just because of the time it takes basically to go from one ocean to another. So in the case of, for example, let's say the Suez Canal, it will take a week longer if they went around Africa than if they were to go through the Suez. So there's quite a significant amount of time in savings, time savings, and also in oil, energy, if you want to put it like that, down the line. And the same thing for New York City to San Francisco. There's a significant time savings. There's a significant energy savings. So the world really depends on these choke points, um, because it facilitates trade. It makes it easier to get things somewhere where you need to go, and at the same token, it also, um, how can I say it? It's better energy wise. It's more efficient than going the long way around. So wait. Now, slow steaming and inventories. So one of the things, and this is where I'm going to talk about energy. Shipping vessels, what they have done, they found out, well, the shipping companies, is that they can lower the speed, their top speed of their vessels, and with that, save money. Basically, they don't run through fuel as fast if they were to go at a slower speed, and that is one of the things that they're doing. The other reason why they're doing it not only is to save money, it's also because there might be environmental, regulation that is a burden on that company. So you need to save so much, or you need to lower your consumption of particular energy source by so much. This is one way they're doing it. So what used to be basically a shorter in time route, it's longer. But these are not necessarily extremely time sensitive objects. They're not people for the most part. They're goods. So they're not in a rush to get, for the most part, from point A from point B. They're gonna get there when they get there, basically. And if that's one way to do it, then they'll do it. Now the problem with this is that a lot of this rely on the choke points. For example, you're going, let's say, from Asia to Europe. Well, you're going to use the Suez Canal, and if all of a sudden the Suez Canal or in the Bab al Mandeb Strait is closed, um, you're not going to be able to use this. You're not going to be able to do slow steaming if you have a particular contract you have to fulfill. You have to arrive at the destination at a particular time. Probably you're not going to make it to begin with, but on top of that, you're going to have to burn through fuel to at least get sort to what you're wanting to do. Now, this is also problematic not only in terms of shipping, but also for the companies that are receiving these goods. A lot of the world inventory relies on what is called just in time, or the Toyota production system, where basically things arrive as they're needed. Now, because of how volatile the world is, companies now need to rely on inventories, which are expensive to maintain. And that is where, knowing how long things are going to get there and actually being on time are important to a lot of companies. A lot of consumer goods are not you're just going to transform one metal into another and, oh, now you have like a phone. No, there's 1,000 little pieces that go into a lot of these things. And one of those pieces that is missing definitely slows down production or halts it. There's a case, for example, which brought up by Toyota, actually, where there was a particular manufacturer of a part and they were defective. Like, basically they had a 2-week defect where they were producing the piece, well, defectively, and it slowed down production for like a week afterwards. It halted production. So it's one of those things that a lot of companies rely on this because it keeps costs low, but it does come with that double-edged sword that, okay, well, now we really don't have inventory, at least sitting around for it to get processed. And with things like slow steaming and the fact that the choke points can be vulnerable to restraints or constraints, it puts them in danger of basically losing money by being inactive. So there are other concerns, for example, like piracy. Piracy is a big one in particular two areas. One is the Bab al Mandab, and the other one is the Straits of Malacca. The Bab al Mandab, which I will touch shortly because literally this is breaking news as I was writing this, for the most part has seen a lot of piracy, particularly coming from Somalia. And we're not talking about, oh, they go after like a tiny little boat or something like that. And we're talking they go for a giant shipping vessel and they hold them hostage. For example, I think like this year they already had like 10 shipping vessels where, they already held them hostage and basically the companies have to pay a ransom for them. Which, if you're a company, that is concerning. There's even a mercenary amount. There's mercenaries that actually get on these boats to protect the shipping vessels. There's boats that they have to get basically extra insurance coverage if they go through here because of how relatively dangerous it is. Now there's also the Straits of Malacca. This is basically between Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia, where same thing. Now, in the case of the Straits of Malacca, it's not as terrible as the case of Indonesia. For the most part, the piracy that does happen is smaller. Like basically, they go after like a container, not the whole ship. They go after like the personal belongings of the crew, not the entire ship. But there is still piracy, and there's still concerns about are we going to go through here when they might steal something. They might take away the goods that they're shipping. So that is definitely a big issue with choke points. Um, Now there's also the aspects of political choke points, where it's not necessarily anything that is problematic in terms of piracy because that's not really a big deal, but there's also problems in terms of differences in the political aspect of it. So, for example, in the Bab al Mandab, which is basically what connects the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, and all that, there is a problem between the Houthis, which I will touch shortly afterwards. There is the Strait of Hormuz, which obviously we see this issue with Iran. There's the Turkish Straits that are controlled by Turkey. For the most part, there's a lot of tension with the Russians because of this, Turkey being a member of NATO. Um, so there's those things. The Straits of Gibraltar, the same thing with the United Kingdom, basically not wanting, adversarial vessels transiting through those choke points. And then the Panama Canal, even though it's not sovereign U.S. territory, the United States does have a lot of say what happens through the Panama Canal. And there's been a lot of political blowback with China's influence in the Panama Canal, which for the most part has been unfounded, but there's definitely still that aspect of it. In the case of the Panama Canal, for the United States, the particular reason is because the Panama Canal is primary to American military objectives. Basically, the idea for America is that they can move a fleet from one ocean to another quickly instead of going through South America, and well, the Panama Canal is quite useful for that. In the case of the other ones, for the most part, like for example the Straits of Gibraltar and the Turkish Straits, those are mostly issues when it comes into, like I said, Russia, and then the Straits of Hormuz and the Bab al Mandab. That's for the most part issues when it comes into uh, the Iranian government and Iranian proxies. One second. One second. Okay. So that's what we're looking at. So in the previous episode, I talked about basically, the constraints that there were regarding the Strait of Hormuz in Iran, basically Iran limiting the amount of shipping vessels that can go through here. This is the reason for it. Basically, for them, it's a political tool per se, so they can control these kind of economic highway per se. So now, what have been the responses to this? Well, there's been the American-led Prosperity Guardian to repel the Houthi threat to shipping. This happened from the Biden administration into the Trump administration, but it's for the most part been relatively already been closed out, where Americans and Europeans, push vessels into the Red Sea, into the Bab al Mandab Strait, along to the Arabian Sea, so they can allow commerce to go through. So that is something that was done and everything like that. The problem is that it wasn't relatively effective. The Houthis were still attacking vessels. For the most part, the way that the Houthis were doing is that it wasn't all vessels. It's anything that was associated one way or another to Israel. So, yeah, take that with what what you will. Um, so, actually, recently with the Trump administration coming into power, what they've done is basically bombed Houthi-controlled areas in Yemen, and that seemed to calm down the thing, but it's still something that attacks to vessels were done. Um, recently, which is the breaking news aspect of it, with the whole situation with the Iranian war and everything like that, the Iran had asked the Houthis to attack shipping if needed, giving certain constraints, and well, now they've done it. Like they, any shipping oil vessel associated with Saudi oil or anything like that now is being attacked by the Houthis in the Bab al Mandab Strait because of the whole situation. Now, in the case of, for example, the Straits of Malacca, the Indonesian and Malaysian navies have actually reached a lot of cooperation interoperability so they can repel these attacks or handle these attacks. But like I said, for the most part, these are, in the case of the piracy from these folks, it's not as problematic as the case of the Somalis. It's very much um, opportunistic attacks. Like, oh look, that vessel doesn't look as guarded. Let's go ahead and see what we can get out of it. So that is what we're looking with the Indonesian and Malaysian navies, looking for ways to, you know, handle the piracy. But those are for the most part the type of responses that happen by them. And why this matters? Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's harder for companies to keep their just-in-time policies. Um, if you don't know when you're going to get a shipment of a particular, input that you need in your production facility, production mechanism, then you're going to have to wait, or you're going to order more and now keep in storage, which is costly. Now, businesses are not really going to lose money out of it; they're going to pass it to the consumer. That is a problem. The second thing is the loss of actual goods. Um, if let's say that a vessel is sunk, and they carry grain or oil or whatever, now that thing is useless. You can't really rescue it. So there's that economic loss on top of the fact that companies are not going to get what they requested originally. Which at the end is going to be basically less things available in the market, which increased costs, be inflation or other things aspect of it. And there's also the loss of life. A lot of these kind of things are not in a vacuum. People die, and it might necessarily be to the point of how can I say, like, oh, companies will never use this kind of places because they need to. There is that risk assessment of there is the chances that things might go south, and is it worth it to go the other way around? No, it's better. Hey, let's put some mercenaries on that ship. Let's see if we can go through this street. Let's see if we can request maybe transport by a friendly power, whatever, and let's go ahead and use it. In the case of things, for example, like the Panama Canal right now has also been affected by things like climate change, where there is not enough water, so they have to reduce the amount of traffic that goes through it, which is as affected. And this is the reason why this matters to you. Even if you don't care about the loss of life, you do care about the pricing. You care about the fact that things are going to be on the shelves. You care about that part from your car that broke down. And if this is not available because some bozo decide to bomb a shipping vessel, you might not know that that's the reason for it, but this affects you one way or another. And this is the main reason why I like to bring this kind of stuff. So, this is not new to y'all. Like I was saying, we talked about this as society a long time ago. These are here, some memes about the Evergreen getting stuck in the Suez Canal, which is actually north of the Bab al Mandeb. But yeah, it's the kind of stuff that has happened. We know that happens, and we just have to basically deal with it. Any questions, concerns?